I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guests today are Doctors Lara and Stephen Sheehi. They're here to discuss their new book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. You can follow them at Instagram at Psychoanalyst Activist, at Decolonizing Humanities, at Decolonizing Photography. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, available from Trapart Books, 2019. You can visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can also follow me at Instagram and Twitter at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_ at Instagram and Twitter. You can support the podcast at our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting Rendering Unconscious podcast and all of my other creative endeavors. I would like to say, first of all, thank you so much for being here. You two have been so busy doing so many events since this book came out. It's astonishing. So thank you for taking the time to come.
Anything for you. Truly.
And I'm glad too that I've gotten to go to several of those events and seen kind of not only your presentation, but the different reactions and questions and how you field them, because it's a difficult topic, and you all get a lot of shit thrown at you, basically. And it's so impressive how you're able to stay your ground, stay on your point, and continue to articulate your points and your ideas so clearly in the face of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, it's funny because I feel like it's a parallel process. I think one of the reasons why we wanted this book in the world and why we wanted to write it like we wrote it, so unrelenting in centering Palestinians, that's the parallel process of when we're presenting. And that's what guides us in how we respond to things, because what we've noticed over the years is most interventions are deflective, right? And it's sort of like what we see with sort of whiteness recentering itself. And it might be for good intentions, and it might be people really trying to earnestly work through things. Or you might have, in this case, super Zionists who just can't handle reality, right? But regardless of what end of the spectrum it's at, the end point is decentering Palestine and Palestinians. And so we really have learned over the years, and in our work and in our struggle and our community building with folks in Palestine, that is the purpose of these interventions, consciously or unconsciously. The purpose is to deflect, and Palestine gets lost in the mix. So how do you disrupt that process? And that's, I think, where our responses come from. But I want you to also lend your analysis to this. But I also feel like, surprisingly, we've had a lot less pushback. I love hearing this from you, because you're seeing it as somebody watching the process unfold. And so it's really interesting to hear you say that. And he and I are just sitting there being like, where are they? We've had people write emails and try to get some of our events canceled, or complaining or threatening people who've invited us not to send referrals anymore to them. That happens behind the scenes, which very few people know that that's what happens. I lost a consulting job because of it, where they were just no, we're not going to do this because you're doing all this stuff with Palestine. But like that's stuff behind the scenes. But in the actual events, I've been surprised and that it's been really like banal, again, decentering things that people end up saying, and you have to field it in a way that doesn't lose the thread.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree. And it's funny because, you know, when you're reared in this struggle for Palestine for a long time, you can see that topography has changed so much. So, you know, through a few people sort of, you know, and they're amateurs, right? It's just kind of like it's very easy to say, when you know your truth, it's very easy to speak your truth, you know. But also, I think we're at a point, you know, when you have an incredibly vanilla mainstream organization like Amnesty International saying that the colonial state now known as Israel is an apartheid state, not only in the occupied territories that are internationally recognized by the UN as occupied territories. I mean, Jerusalem, West Bank, and Golan. I mean, Gaza, and of course Golan. No one recognizes these as anything but being occupied by Israel. So that's not a controversial thing. So Amnesty didn't say Israel is an apartheid state just in the occupied territories. It said all Palestinians under Israeli rule are second-class, if that, citizens or subjects. And so I think, you know, when we're that far in, it becomes very easy also to speak your truth compared to, you know, 20 years ago, where you couldn't say the word Palestine. I mean, we did, but just the word Palestine itself would be incendiary.
It's still true in psychoanalysis.
That's true, but it is. And psychoanalysis, to bring it back to psychoanalysis, it still remains politically a remarkably staid and reactionary field when it comes to Palestine. You know, so
even though the tides really are,
the tide has changed.
They're shifting, and
100%.
You see folks, you know, one of the things I've been touching about this book, particularly in the work we've done with this book, but also the, you know, being engaged, like you said, doing so many things, is seeing people shift over the last, let's say, 10 years. Like I'll speak for you've been active a lot longer. In psychoanalysis, I've been pretty active for the last 10 or so years. And to see the massive shift people have made, and some of the touching things is to like be along the journey with people as these truths become more and more difficult to deny. Like if you are now not sort of on board with why Palestine is an important question, why psychoanalysis needs to take this seriously, why it's our ethical imperative to speak to these issues, like there's some very heavy duty disavowal you're engaging in, or collusion, and that is ideological, period. Because I think we can see where the whole field is moving, and that there still is this piece, you know, a small piece even of super progressive people fighting every other fight under the sun. When Palestine is mentioned, something shifts, right? There's something deeply troubling still about that piece. And at the same time, it really has been just remarkable to see the shift. And for me, I think that in large part, that is due to the organizing and community building and pushing of largely folks of color and minority folks, more and more Arab and Palestinian voices in the context of the United States psychoanalysis, where like we joke that there like used to be one or two of us, and like now we have a whole network. And then the folks that are in solidarity with us, and that are in solidarity with us not just like performatively, but out of this real commitment to liberation struggles overall, like recognizing the synergy between these liberation struggles, and that those of us, all of us, and like I obviously account you in this, right? And the people that we know, is to recognize how all these struggles actually are central to the work of psychoanalysis. That's not a periphery thing. We're not like being social justice warriors. I'm putting in square quotes because, you know, that's used pejoratively. But to truly say part of our psychoanalysis, you know, when people are always like, this is not my psychoanalysis. I'm like, you damn straight it's not your psychoanalysis. Like, that's why we're pushing, exactly what we're pushing for is this psychoanalysis that sees these things as intricately, you know, related and sort of connected. And that we refuse, all of us have been refusing to do this ridiculous split. And seeing that as like the life force of what this emerging generation of psychoanalysis really looks like.
Yeah, and even you're talking, I was talking to you the other day, and I was just thinking about, we've said this before. I think, you know, number one, as we've said before, is like, why would psychoanalysis not be saturated with the real world in the last, you know, 5-10 years of what has happened in the real world and those changes? And so many people have dissettled. You know, they're dissettled by the Me Too movement, about, you know, their undeniable place and positionality towards whiteness, and, you know, with the movement for Black lives, you know. So I think it's easy to call it a generational shift, and I think I always struggle with the generational argument, but I think it's definitely one of its time, right? Of a zeitgeist sort of thing, you know, that like the world has collapsed upon itself, and the world has collapsed upon psychoanalysis, where it's not allowed to hold those disavows anymore. I think, as you said, organizing, there's a lot of old guard out there who've been punching out, you know, the struggle for Palestine for 20-25 years, you know. Which
is why the generational argument doesn't hold up.
No, I mean, and that's, you know, Lynn and Steve Portuguese and Nancy Hollander and
Susan Gutwell,
yeah. You know, there are people who are just amazing. So like, what is it different? They were doing that work for a long time. So what is the difference? And I think the fact of the matter is that, you know, the worldliness of psychoanalysis can't be ignored fully anymore. You know, this contrived sort of, you know, binary between the social and the psyche and the therapeutic space and non-therapeutic space, you know, it has kind of crashed upon themselves. So just like whiteness is really in a state of crisis, right? A crisis in maintaining its hegemony, and it will co-opt, and it will find ways to recuperate itself and you know, include non-whiteness or expand whiteness to be more inclusive. Psychoanalysis, I think, is at that moment too, which is, again, just to bring it back to your comment, just kind of like, you know, these spaces that we're in, for us, they are not that difficult, you know. And on the other hand, like, we're so shored up because if you have, you know, 20 people in the room and only 1 or 2 are these, you know, people, there's the old guard right wingers, this is an inversion from what it used to be, where it'd be 19 against you and 1, you know, ally in the room. So which has been what it's looked like, you know. And you know, of the places you've come, I think you've probably noticed that too. You know, 1 or 2 outliers.
No, that makes sense. It is a big shift in that way. But I think it's also important how you equate it, or how you draw the parallel. Like, if people want to understand what colonization was like for people being colonized, there's an example that's happening right now and has been happening for the past 70-80 years, and look how people are dealing with it. And this whole argument of like there's both sides and these kinds of things that we see on the listservs, it's just absurd.
Yeah. There's both sides. And you know, the latest iteration of these things, we see these conflagrations on listservs across, you know, across different organizations, across different subgroups. The shift in the latest conflagration that I know you also have been reading is that people are finally starting to say things like, this would be absurd for us to say there are two sides to like
Right.
Jim Crow South, for example.
Right. Or was there a Holocaust or not?
Exactly. This, like, nobody would ever think to say these things because they're unconscionable, right? Not because you're like sort of going along with the moment or being performative, but because truly it would be unconscionable to say, when you see something so explicit, when you have eyewitnesses, when you have narratives, indigenous narratives telling you about these things, that says a lot about you, that your choice is to ask these questions, to really find, and who put the burden of proof on the person who's going through this to explain to you. And this is part of like the Amnesty International thing is really important in a mainstream way, right? Because it's such a mainstream, organization that has taken this sense. But for folks on the ground, this is also deeply like it's always this two-way thing of like, yes, recognition and sort of legitimacy is important. And on the other hand, how many Palestinians have had to say this for how long? You're not telling them anything new when you say this. It has a particular importance. And at the same time, when we hear a report like that, it's upon us to say, why did it take us until this report to come out for us to like truly get what's going on? When countless people have told you, when Palestinians have said this thing, this very thing, like verbatim for this long, and all of a sudden Amnesty International does it and they're like, oh, okay, now we believe it, right? It's sort of like the mass indigenous graves that have been dug out in the settler colonial state now known as Canada, right? None of us doubted that they were there because indigenous people have been telling us for ages that they are there. And then all of a sudden, when people start seeing them, they're like, oh, this is undeniable. It's the same. And I think I'm using those examples because I think that's the next step for us, is to really, if we're taking it seriously, to look at ourselves as a field, to look at ourselves in the psychoanalytic way that we supposedly espouse. There's something curious about why that continues to happen. Why is it that we continue to place the burden of proof? And who has to constantly tell us over and over and over again, this is actually what's happening? And why is there no movement until like an external source that we legitimize ends up telling us that, right? And this is part of the reason actually why in our book, it's exclusively Palestinian voice. We really don't really talk about the state now known as Israel. We don't really talk about Israeli people's sort of experience of this, because that is what is missing, is Palestinian voices sort of articulating this in an unrelenting way. Not because they have been saying this forever, but because people don't listen, don't sort of place it in the same position as they might other voices.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to add also, and thank you for that, because that's really important to think about, as you were saying, sort of, invitations, whether they're abstract and metaphorical or concrete, to dialogue, to find two sides, to have discussions, to be civil, which, of course, I forgot what you said about they're unconscionable sort of things to ask and unconscionable positions to hold, because they're unconscionable because we know the political position that the other side is. If someone is a Holocaust denier, we know they're not just like, innocently saying that, hey, I'm just arguing the science, No, you're an anti-Semite. You're an anti-Semite who's aligning yourself with Nazis who had an unquestionable plan and executed that plan unquestionably to genocide the Jews of Europe. We know that, right? And if you kind of, right, so there's like, no one takes that. There's no ambiguity in sort of saying, hey, let's just dialogue with this person who says, okay, it wasn't 6 million Jews, it was 200,000, right? Because that's what these deniers do, right? There's no, we know you, you anti-Semite. We know where you're coming from and we know what your motivations are, right? But when Palestine happens, somehow, and that's the second, there's an innocence about it. Like, hey, we're just talking, we just want to know. And I think it happens like that with Palestine. And it happens like that with issues of race in the Silicon now known as the United States, because in the end, those positions are always anxious and looking and understand that their future is in jeopardy in recognizing truth, right? It's like, you don't really want you really don't want to know what's in their unconscious to hear about their uncovered memories, because that might be indicting, right? And that's kind of the world that they live in. So, it's about when these invitations to dialogue and to salih,
to reconcile,
is really a desire, a compulsion to ensure future for themselves, to ensure futurity. And their futurity, the
way they see it.
And that very futurity is always constituted on the abject relation, whether it's through hierarchy or whatever, to in the case of the Palestinians, in the case of racism in the United States, Black folk or indigenous folk. So I think that's also like this idea, and I think that has become more. This is the crisis. It's the crisis in liberalism. It's the crisis in psychoanalysis. It's the crisis in our political polity today. It's an undeniable sort of. Yeah. We know what's happening. You're trying to save yourself. You want to talk now, and actually, Fanon says that, right? Fanon says, at the moment the native reaches for a gun, the colonizer extends like an olive branch and says, "Hey, let's talk." And then, of course, reaches to the colonized bourgeoisie as the interlocutor to sort of,
to snuff out that.
To talk about commonalities and humanity. They start talking about humanity there and common humanity, and against the violence that one would do against the colonial system.
Right. You said you don't want to know the unconscious of somebody, because they'll disclose what reality is. We have so many examples of that in the book, like these Israeli psychoanalysts who are supervisors of Palestinian trainees who are becoming clinician psychologists, who are trained psychoanalytically, who train their Palestinian trainees psychoanalytically. And all of a sudden, you see this collapse happen, like you're saying, when the Palestinian patient starts to talk about their realities, right? And like dictate and sort of draw the contours of the violence of everyday life, whether that's what it looks like living in a camp, or on the flip side, the sort of really insidious side also is when they disclose dreams for themselves, or ambitions that fall outside of the racist ideas of what Palestinians can do, right? Because they're second-class citizens, which you see. And again, some of this is very conscious, some of it is unconscious, because it's structured by racism, right? And structured by an apartheid system that already positions people as second-class citizens. So how are we expecting that all these, whether it's training or clinical sites or any of these things, aren't also saturated with this? But all of a sudden, we have so many examples of this, of all of a sudden, the psychoanalytic supervisor forgetting everything psychoanalytic and relating to the patient as just a purely behavioral being, and being like, they're just anxious. Oh, this is time limited. They're done because now they're just talking. And like, these moments where at such like affectively laden moments where the patient is legitimately just starting to talk and has pushed through something in the transference or countertransference in a way where they're at the precipice of some liberatory space. And it's legible to us. It's very legible to the patient and the analyst clinician. And all of a sudden, that's the moment that the supervisor wants to disrupt that. And really, our reading came to be like, part of it is that if you have a talking subject, a speaking subject, they will tell you what reality actually looks like. And that's unbearable for the racist, for the settler, for whatever, to confront through the words of a patient the violence you are inflicting by merely being a settler in the state, right? Because you're a settler interacting with indigenous people. There's violence embedded in that no matter what, no matter how good you are, there's a violence embedded in that. And so we see these moments of like shutting down. And if you're anybody that knows psychoanalysis, looking at this and reading it and being like, this looks so obvious what's happening, that you are truly stifling the truth telling to be able to continue the disavowal that is central to your makeup, central to your being, central to this futurity that you're talking about, right? Your version of what future looks like is what becomes your primary organizing psychic force, basically.
Yeah, because if you start to recognize certain things, it's like that thread in your sweater.
Like the Weezer song.
And you start pulling it, and what happens to the sweater, right?
Yeah.
And it just unravels. So in many ways, it's kind of, and in the Arab American community, we always hear this, and my mom always says this, and all liberals who are maybe pro-Palestine say this, like, oh, if people only knew. That's unconscious. No, they know. Knowledge is not
the issue.
Well, it's the knowledge that is produced to uphold ideological structures, and the knowledge that is repressed, right? They know the knowledge. Their real with a capital R is actually the real, right? And their imaginary is actually only an apparatus to maintain the real with a capital R. Their fucking nightmares and their true knowledge of things stays behind the bar if it's not too Lacanian, right? Right? I mean, to keep it at bay, right? So when you recognize at one moment, if you recognize that you're in Palestine and you're an Israeli, a Jewish Israeli, and you're in a house that's older than 1948, built before 1948, it's very likely that house was inhabited by Palestinians, and which some people can acknowledge, but that those Palestinians were forcibly removed, and you're living and you're perpetuating. Your presence in that perpetuates, and it's a lineage to that violence, right? So just that thread in acknowledging this, for example, Palestinian, their grievance or their pain or their historical trauma, they know it. It's known, but it can't. But it must then, therefore, I mean, that's how unconscious processes work, right? So you might have a very nice Israeli in general who thinks that they care about Palestinians, but they you can see.
But don't call them Palestinians.
But don't call them Palestinians.
Call them Arabs.
So yeah, I think those are the mechanisms. I don't know if that's too abstract or anything, but yeah.
No, it's not,
it's
because
everywhere.
Yeah. But
no, it's everywhere, and it's really clear. And I mean, even like in the US, growing up in the US, like I don't know if it's a joke or a trope or whatever, they say like, oh, don't build your house on a Native American burial ground, right? And it was like, then your house will be cursed and you'll have bad luck. It's like the entire United States is built upon stolen land, It's like, and that's like a joke that's going around or whatever. So it's like right there.
Right. Also, that's the kindest thing in the world if you were just cursed. You're lucky it's just a curse. Well,
in the United States too, I mean, this is the thing, settler colonialism works in a number of different ways. Sometimes, and this is the beauty of Patrick Wolf's work, right? It shows that it can actually work in exact opposite ways to maintain the same goals, right? Patrick Wolf talks about that. So one drop of blood will make a person black, and one drop of white blood will make an indigenous person white, right? Because it's all about
for different ends.
It's all about the racial superiority and stealing the land and labor, right? So you have different configurations to meet the same logic and end of settler colonialism, which is domination, stealing of land, right? Racial supremacy. And it's funny because like in the United States, of course, unlike Zionism, they didn't go there, they didn't steal the land and rename everything necessarily. Some things they did in these fantastic things to make it their own. They actually had the sort of the gall to actually keep and mutilate indigenous names, right? So how do you live in a place called Massachusetts, right? And not say you stole the land when your place is called the land, it's named after the people who you stole the land from. And then you actually come across this complex logic of they all disappeared. You know, they gave us turkeys and some gourds and it was a nice day. And then, I don't know, they just walked into the woods and we never heard of them again.
It's a specific type of psychosis. I've never thought of it like that, of like the different strands, like Patrick Wolf does, that we should do like a psychological parallel.
50 shades of psychosis, of colonial
of settler psychosis. Like here's one way it can look, where you can like literally name something and pretend you made up the name, even though it was the people who lived here.
Right.
And here's this other type of psychosis where you literally just pretend there weren't a people.
Right.
Period.
Right.
You know.
Well, you can pray to a wall in Jerusalem that was built by the Ottomans and call it the wall of David.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's really funny how these sort of processes work.
Yeah.
And the myth that you mentioned is a functional myth. It's not a blindness, it's a functional myth. It's there because, okay, you know, okay, we killed them all paradigm means that they're all gone and you can't do anything about it. So there's land back kind of doesn't mean anything, right? But somehow, again, about the unconscious, it's also it's a disclosing upon themselves, right? The fear, the poltergeist
Yes.
Movie is or Amityville or whatever. You know, these are like the settler will always tell on themselves. They're telling on themselves. You know, those aren't the real demons of the indigenous people who are haunting you. That's you. You're haunting you. You know.
Yeah. No.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's why we're sort of we really came about this, because we saw these things happen over and over and over and over again in ways that like psychoanalysis gives us, you know, a way to read patterns and say, if you see these patterns happen, there's probably something to it, right? Let alone the sort of overlay of the social and the political and the geopolitical and history and material reality and all these sorts of stuff. And I think that's where it comes together in the book, that we don't give up any of these for the other, because we see them as intimately, in a very Fanonian sense, as intimately involved. But part of this, what you're talking about, is like we sort of talk about this a little bit in the book about like settler reality bending, and that is what constantly happens. And part of what happens, and especially in the case of Palestine, but indigenous folks the world over, is a refusal to engage in that reality bending, and how that refusal ends up being received as an aggression on the settler. And it can be in very small ways and then in very big ways. Like small ways, like speaking Arabic becomes an aggression on that settler reality bending, because if you hear Arabic, then there is this unravel, like all of it is like paths to the truth that you need to like really bend to not confront every single day. And there's this like, I may have told you this just anecdotally, just me and you talking as friends before, but I will never forget driving, and I've said this to you a million times, just this like to see the extent of reality bending just in Palestine. And we, all of it is Palestine to us. Like when we go, it's all Palestine, right? But to see the extent of it and how casually it is, but also then to see how miserably it has failed. As somebody who's a Lebanese Arab, who we were separated from our Palestinian siblings by external forces, but we share terrain. Like Lebanon's terrain looks very similar to Palestine's terrain. And I mean by like shrubbery or rocks, or you feel like you're home. Like when I go to Palestine, I'm like, this looks like Lebanon to me. There's something very familiar about it. It's not just the people and the language, it's what it looks like. And I can't describe what that feels like, to just be like, I know this land. I know what this looks like. But we take public transportation everywhere when we're in Palestine. And that has been actually a political commitment of ours, to be like, what is it like to actually travel like Palestinians travel, not on apartheid roads? Because a lot of folks who go visit who have passports that aren't, that aren't the IDs, Palestinian IDs, have the ability, if they wanted to take apartheid roads that only Israelis can go on, right? And that means that, like, from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, how far is it, kilometers?
I mean, it's right next door. It's maybe
right.
10, 15. I don't know.
It should take 15 minutes to get to, but it takes an hour, because you're going through checkpoints and you're taking public transportation, and the apartheid wall snakes around. Or you could take an apartheid road, and it would take you, and because everything is easy for settlers, and they're allowed on those roads, and Palestinians are not, right? So that's what it means to really be in an apartheid state. But one time when one of our friends was driving us on those apartheid roads, I was just looking out and just taking in, and you see these sort of really hideous, like, buildings, imports that don't belong in that space. It's like, I know what our land looks like, and these imports are European or North American or whatever, like just the style of building and how they're built, and they all look alike, and they're like, and you just look around and you're like, what I see through that, I mean, obviously I see the violence of settler colonialism, but what I also struck me was I saw the rocks, and I'm like, those are our rocks. Even through all of this, I can see the shit you can't see. A settler's gonna pass by that and not think twice about it, because they're not of that land. They don't know the value and what that rock looks like on the other side, right? And how they're connected, and how me as a Lebanese Arab can go there and be like, this is how I'm connected to my Palestinian siblings through this. But that's part of the reality bending. Like here in the context of settler colonial state of the United States, like, you're just walking through and you think this is Boston, and like, you think there aren't indigenous people, because those fixtures are not legible to you. These things aren't legible to you because you are a settler. And it's just, I guess I say that as an example of like the small and big ways in which this reality bending happens. And then to bring it back, why our book is about psychoanalysis and about clinicians, is to say, what does it mean then when we collude as clinicians in this type of violence, small and big,
Yeah, so I wanted, something we haven't really talked about, so as Lara said, we really don't usually talk about, Zionism, Zionist ideology, or the history of Zionism, or the history of the Zionist state. We really don't, because it's, a lot of people are doing that, that's fine. But I was just thinking about, the relationship between subjects and land, right? So Palestinian subjects and Arab subjects to the land, which is, and we say this in Arabic, it's Arab land. We say that it's Arab land. And not to sound nationalistic or anything like this, but sort of, Palestine, Lebanon, they are, in terms of historical social relations, they're a country. They're a country, quotation marks. They're a social being. It's a place that, you have hundreds of years of interrelations, and their families marrying. Thank you. But just thinking about the ideological apparatuses that are able to try to erase indigenous existence and history and reality, the real reality, material reality. The settler ideology. When you think about Palestine, of course, Israeli Zionists feel they have a relationship to the land. That was the first thing that they tried to establish ideologically, even before moving there, right? And that ideological relationship with the land is, of course, the Jews live in exile in Galut and have to come home to Palestine, where they used to be. So there's this biblical mythology. So their relation to the land, this relationship, the Zionist relationship to the land, everyone thinks, oh, Israelis have the Sabra. They made the desert bloom. What are you talking about? No relation to the land. Of course they have relation. They made the desert bloom. They made this cut, right? And it's like, no, that's a psychotic relationship to the land. Because just like manifest destiny makes you think that, land is yours to be claimed, right?
Mm-hmm.
The relationship that this intimacy, this compelling, intimacy that Zionists feel to Palestine, to the land of Palestine, is one built on a psychosis. And of course, Freud says that about the Herbian wall, right? It's called basically a fetish, right? And it's built, but this is what power does, this is what colonialism does. It makes a psychotic process built on disavowals and reality and rejecting reality into the normative logic of being, which is
facts on the ground.
Facts on the ground. Mm-hmm. And that's what actually where power is, where they can create facts on the ground. Right. So you can create in North America a whole lore of the pioneer, right? The brave pioneer who really made this country what it is, and all the things that they fought, right? And how they made this country struggled, right? And the same thing with the Sabra, right? And how they made the desert bloom and right? And but it's really one that's based. So affectively, we're not disavowing that. Affectively, a Zionist feels a relationship with that land. They feel ownership of it. They feel ownership so much of it. They dispossessed and ejected 700,000 Palestinians, 70% of the population in 1948, and then subjugated the rest after 1977. That's a pretty powerful compulsion. So effectively, we're not denying they have that affect, but in terms of reality, in terms of the real relations, in terms of the actual relationship, it's one that is based on fantasy, right? Okay. But it becomes reality because they are empowered through a lot of things, right? To enact a fantasy and make it into reality, which is basically also the story of whiteness. It's a story of white European settler hegemony or colonial hegemony globally. It's how how the Europe spread modernity and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
right. And so this is related to Patrick Wolf too, right? Who says that part of settler colonialism is to make the settler native. And that is how you do that, is you have this lore that then becomes normative. So then like the claim, even though that claim to the land, that compulsion is so much so that you would do all these things, the indigenous claim to the land becomes like what's aggressive, because you are not, right? It's an inversion. That's the thing. It's an inversion of reality.
And you're crazy for saying land back.
Yeah, exactly.
What do you mean land back? That's crazy. What do you want us to all just leave?
Right.
Right. So I could see next time I steal something and go to court and the judge is in front of me, I'm like, are you nuts? You want me to give this car back?
Well, all this to say, this is why it's a psychoanalytic question too. And like all of us that run away from this and say, what does psychoanalysis have to do with any of this? Well, either you think psychoanalysis has the tools and the language and the depth and the expansiveness to talk about things that with this complexity, and when I say complexity, I don't mean difficulty. It's actually quite simple what we're seeing. But the etiology of where it comes from and why it happens, I think psychoanalysis is well positioned to do that, right? So when people respond and go, this isn't psychoanalysis, I'm like, you don't trust your theory. Like, why do you hate your theory so much? That's what I want to say about, why aren't you a psychoanalyst?
No, I think psychoanalysis is perfect for addressing this because, it's like when you're in an analysis, or when you are undergoing analysis and you start to see these things in your own life, then you start to see how pervasive these patterns are, and traumas are and things. And like you can see it everywhere. And it's the same sort of thing. Once you start seeing this, it's like you could see it at all levels. It's everywhere. It's right in front of your face.
Yes, exactly. And that's Marcello saying hello.
Hi,
And
Marcello.
he's in deep agreement with this
saying here,
and warning the settlers that liberate yourself from your ideology.
And I think is it the recent Freud and Said conference at the Freud Museum that you were at? That was a really good point that I want to bring up as well, is that somebody brought up to you like, oh, but isn't like the United States too far gone and it's not possible to give land back? And I was just like shocked at hearing that. But of course, I realize that I hang out with people that are like I don't know, amazing. And so then when I like experience other people in the world, I'm like, what? How do you not know this?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is, we hear that a lot. And I think that is and I think part of what we said, I don't remember exactly, but is that is how settler colonial logics works. So that we do have a place like the United States, it's an active, living, breathing settler colony, more so than, it has continued. It hasn't, none of this has stopped, but that it allows us to think that this is a post-settler state, right? That somehow we're not there anymore, or like Canada is no longer there, or Australia or New Zealand. And it's like, no, maybe we're in different phases. And I do think that he ended up saying like, we're in different phases of that. Okay, yes, that in terms of its peak or its sort of activity. But even that, it's like, no, on the daily, and this is what Indigenous scholars and activists and folks teach us all, on the daily, people's lives are denied and they're erased constantly. This has not stopped since contact, quote unquote,
But the United States is really new. That's the thing. It's like people act like this is ancient history. And it's like, okay, I'm from Miami. Miami is a name of Native peoples. And it's like the people there, like Miami was incorporated as a city in like 1896. I mean, it's like not that long ago. And like the Seminole Wars, where they're like fighting people, were in like the 1890s. Like this is just over 100 years ago. It's not that long ago. My house is older than that.
Right? Yeah.
No, I think it's funny because you're talking and you just think about, so the question you asked was great, and I want to think that question was a rhetorical softball question to us, right? So I think that's how I want to choose to think that was being asked, which is sort of like asking us to flesh out, like, that what we're saying, the decolonial ask of land back is not a metaphor, right? It's real, right? And I think you said it really well, because I think what we've been talking about is that, the condition by which Indigenous people live, whether it's in Palestine or the settler colony now known as the United States, is that we tend to think that the lives of, this is kind of riffing off what you were saying, made me think, it's the lives of Indigenous people here, we tend to think are an after effect of the trauma, right? This is, of course, the trauma discourse within psychoanalysis, and it has a lot of currency today, especially including in terms of issues of race and blackness and chattel slavery and these sorts of things. Sort of like folks live the after effect of the trauma. And you talk about transgenerational trauma and et cetera, and I'm not negating that necessarily or belittling it, but I think it deflects from the real conditions of reality, which is Indigenous folk don't live the after effects of settler colonialism. They live in the reality of settler colonialism. Then that. It is meant to do that. It is meant to try to erase that, right? Black folk don't live in the after effects of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, right? They live the conditions of a racial, so, you know, a racialized country and a racialized existence, right? Psychoanalysis has a real challenge because you deal with subjects every day coming into your, you know, into your room, right? And there's a reparative or a reproductive challenge that they have for them, right? And so I think this is actually the juggernaut of psychoanalysis itself, that they find themselves in. Like they really are at some level at the subjective front line about how to deal with these contradictions and these violences in a very real every day. Not, oh, let me tell you, you know, because I'm, you know, great child of a slave, this is where I am. No, it's because you live in a racist society. You know, that might have impacted your parents a particular way, which is fucks you up on a very personal fucking level because they're fucking damaged or they're, you know, certain, you know, have certain things going inflicted on you. So you have those classical sort of motions of the relationship between, you know, your intersubjectivity, but also understanding that it is also largely socially constructed by this regime of social violence that is built upon your being, right, or negating your being. So again, to return back to Palestine, I think it becomes I think Palestine is such a live topic because it's in vivo even more, right? You see it. People are being destroyed, are still being removed from their homes. Not, you know, not unlike out west with, you know, Dapple and all that sort of, by the way.
Right, exactly.
Or Western, in the state now known as Canada, and the Wet'suwet'en people.
Right.
But we see this on a daily basis. We know every day a Palestinian it's a chance with death. Right? This Abdul-Majid Assad, who just last week was going to work, got stopped at a checkpoint, pulled out of his car, beaten up, tied, thrown into a garbage dump, and died. Right? When he woke up in the morning, you know, he thought he was going to wake up that next day too. But that's the condition of being. It's not a condition only of living under occupation. It's a condition of being a subject under settler colonialism, and that's what Palestine shows us. It shows us actually, in many ways, what's happening here in a much more diffuse level. Right.
Yeah. And that's why I think we have a central role as clinicians, because you brought in like what psychoanalysis potentially can do, but also, you know, you indirectly also signal to what we don't do, right? And I think this is like my next project is a book on technique, on anti-oppressive technique. I'm really interested in this question. I've been taking notes, and part of it emerges from this work with Palestine, but also emerges from, you know, some of the workshops you and I have been in and attended and sort of looked at and seeing all these things. But where I'm really struck by, and this is why I wanted to do this technique project, was the ways in which we directly and indirectly deny that reality, the lived now, and we displace things into the past. Like, and in many ways, psychoanalytic theory lends itself to that, if you want to practice that way. Because for me, what I've always said is it's also really lends itself to attending to those daily lived now. When you have an embodied, living, breathing human being in front of you, telling you about what is happening in their daily life as a complex human being that is at the vectors of their identities that are tied intimately into histories and relational histories, how is it that we continuously choose a technique that displaces it into the past? There's something there on a structural level, not on an individual level as a clinician, right? There's something that's being passed down in our curriculum, in our training, in our institutes that support that particular type of ideology. And that's settler colonial logics that then hides itself and looks like it's just normative, that we're doing a good job teaching technique, right? and I think I've said this before, you and I, and maybe even in one of the times I've talked to you before on this, but I can't repeat this enough, is that we're not introducing anything new. When we speak to these issues as living, breathing conditions that people are in, whether that's racism or settler colonial logics, which is a part of settler colonial logics, or classism, or fat phobia, or transphobia, or any of the things that the folks who talk to us, when we bring that in, that is not an imposition. That is speaking to the truth they live every single day, which is what you're saying, right? They know it in their body. This is also what Fanon teaches us, that there's something it's visceral. It lives in the muscular. People have dreams about it. They live it every single day. There might be an adjustment to it, so it becomes like a natural fixture. But this, I know you've had this experience. The second you bring it in, it's not like people go, oh, well, wait a second, let me see. Am I really Black? You know, like nobody fucking does that. Everybody knows what it means, right? And so there's something really interesting to me from a technical standpoint. But what is this? And it happens on such a grand scale that there's something bigger and structural happening in our field, in the way we teach it, and in the way ideologically psychoanalysis is structured, to have us make those technical decisions every single time, to make people ghosts, to make people in the past, to make their struggles of like just a descendant symptom, right? Yeah, I think that might have to be a chapter. Descendant symptoms.
I like that.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, anytime I've said something, people go, I'm so glad you said that, actually. That's usually what I would have said. I'm so glad you said that. Or thank you for saying that.
Exactly.
Well, you know, that it's funny because, you know, again, it's how do we talk about psychoanalysis in a genuine, non-pedantic, but actually politically important way, right? That's what you're saying. So I think what's important, I think what you're saying is that when the process, it's, you know, psychoanalysis, like anything else, is a structure as well, right? And a structure, and it does certain things, and it may, you know, it holds a lot of different people in a lot of different political positions, right? But you're asked at one level, in what way does it collude? What ways are you being a good analyst or a good psychologist if you collude? You're doing it right. Right? You're doing it right now. And if you step out of that, then actually you are not, you might have an ethical boundary violation, ethical violation, or you're just doing something wrong, or
that's not really psychoanalysis.
That's not really psychoanalysis. It's like, exactly. I mean, so of course, if you're an insurgent analyst, right, or psychologist, you somehow there's a conflict. And I think it's easy for us to say, like, man, yeah, they want you to go in there and patch everybody up and send them back into the factories, which is like, yes, they do. But I think also just think, when you think about psychoanalysis itself, you also have to think about maybe like, how does it also fit into the larger systems of power?
Yeah.
And it's invested in its own authority. Okay, so it can hold a multitude of positions and a multitude of opinions and a multitude of techniques, but it's just like settler colonial logics has its own goals. Psychoanalysis' own goal is longevity and maintaining its own authority and its own position. So it'll do what it needs to do to maintain that.
Yeah.
You know, so you'll see it's going to be it has been much more race conscious, much more, you know, it's made movement on gender queer issues, right? And, oh, wonderful, you know, but of course, because otherwise it might actually be confronted by, you know, the thronging masses with hammers to smash it to pieces. So, you know, so how, I think this is the thing about how we have to think about psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
How does it constantly work to maintain its authority,
right,
to maintain its longevity?
Yeah.
You know,
which is why it's an interesting question about the seams where like it can't hold that expansion anymore, right? I mean, systems of power will expand and contract as they need to maintain themselves, right? It's sort of maintain coherence. And so this expansion of like talking about race and all this stuff, and I don't want to be over cynical about it. There are some people who are genuinely taking these things up. I'm not saying that that's empty, right? But we're talking about the larger structure of psychoanalysis. We're not talking about like individual efforts to do this. And if we follow that logic, then these seams where it's just too much for psychoanalysis. And that's where Palestine really comes in consistently, right? That's the place where we see the collapse happen. That's the place where like, I just can't hold this together with this conversation about transness, or I can't hold this together with this conversation about race. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen with those things, because good Lord, you and I both have fucking seen how people just fall to pieces when you suggest that, you know, trans women are women, and they fall apart. Exactly. I'm just having that Can the Monster Speak is right here, which is a great example of this, and not a long time ago. But that it's really, that's an interesting thing for us as a field to be like, can we start to be curious about where are these seams and why? And what is this collapse actually showing us about ideology, about certain logics, about, you know, I guess what you said before is like, what is this fantasy of yourself and the type of future that you're trying to ensure as a field that's being threatened in this moment, you know?
I also want to just say, you know, what we've heard, like, it's funny, we've been talking to a few people in actually different countries in the continent now known as Europe, even though I don't know if Britain's in Europe anymore or not. But people actually saying about psychoanalysis is thinking about, you know, this whole, you know, slightly cliche, unfortunately, discussion of like the politics and psychoanalysis, right? But actually, rather than thinking about, can psychoanalysis be political? Can it do a certain whatever job that's, you know, that's actually ethical? It's returning the returning the political ethos within psychoanalysis to itself, to return its disruptive esprit de corps to itself that actually was lost, right? And you know, we very, very rarely elevate, you know, a bunch of old white folks from, you know, early 20th century Europe, but there was a disruptive element, and not all of them were male. Quite a few of them weren't women. But there is something that can be fundamentally disruptive about psychoanalysis, which is why it's always, I think it's it's an incredibly anxious field, precisely for this reason, right?
Yes, especially if we're not censoring. And I know we've talked about this before, Vanessa, with Molly and Jamie too, like these discussions around if we're not censoring who does psychoanalysis and where psychoanalysis happens, that's even more likely that you're going to have a disruptive psychoanalysis. But this sort of like institutionalizing, constricting, policing, disciplining, it's easier to hold on to authority if you do it that way.
Right.
You know.
Right.
Yeah, and that's really at the end what all of these positionings are, is positioning to keep power.
It's really the tension between what kind of field do we want it to be, and I'm speaking as a non-clinician, mind you. Do you want it to be one that is stabilizing or disruptive? Disruptive in a good sense, where you disrupt, what you're disrupting is logics of violence
and normativity
and extraction and oppression and hierarchy, right? Oh, is that what this field is doing? Can do? I think it can do that. Or are you stabilizing, modifying, allowing it? Your psychoanalysis has an incredible way to lend elasticity to the contradictions within capitalism. Yeah. Right. Yes, I understand you're in a bad way. And, you know, yes, you're alienated because of capitalism, but you really are a full self. That doesn't help me. Thank you for telling me I'm alienated. Can you please smash capitalism, which is the source of that, you know, or racial capitalism? You know what I mean? So, I mean, this is the tension within psychoanalysis. Again, just to return to what we were saying in the beginning, I think this moment now is the moment where that sort of contradiction cannot no longer be held.
Yeah.
It's one of those moments,
Yeah.
I think there have been several in the past. And that's where you have this wonderful, beautiful tension, this rise of some amazing people in your field, recognition of the elders who've done the work also. Mm-hmm. So there really is this sort of groundswell that kind of tells us about this moment, and I also think that also allows that groundswell, that moment, that sort of change has allowed us to speak about Palestine.
Yeah. And if the folks in Palestine are doing this work like as a natural part of their living, right? Mm-hmm. Where they're like, that separation is not there. So when you talk to them, there isn't this, of course they speak about the technical tensions around when is this, when's it a stand-in, when's it, because they're incredibly versed in psychoanalytic theory and process and technique. Mm-hmm. But one thing fundamentally is there's no split between the clinic and what's happening outside, right? Because like in one of the cases when you have tear gas pouring through the windows and you're sitting with a patient, how do you maintain a position that the outside is separate? You're both inhaling the tear gas, and we know who that tear gas comes from. It's the occupying power that's outside that's leaking in tear gas, right?
Stand back, free Palestine.
Exactly.
Hashtag on that.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Drs. Lara and Sheehi. Be sure to check out their book, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. For more, you can listen to previous episodes of Rendering Unconscious podcast. Rendering Unconscious episode 43 and 143 with Dr. Lara Sheehi, as well as Rendering Unconscious episode 61 with Dr. Sheehi. Be sure to follow them on social media at Psychoanalyst Activist, Decolonizing Humanities, and Decolonizing Photography at Instagram. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. And now, unity via plurality. From the album Switching Mirrors. Enjoy. Growing infinitely. Before she further delved into the symbolism and background, the personality, pronoun we, which is where, and feel your breath, set themselves free. Thanks. Unity via plurality. Seen is never consciously introduced. Opposites combining. You will see the tendency. Edging the is the key. Truly transformed. To shout. Gregarious form can, certain stage. To thee, provided it is animated. We are situated in this gap. This of to the client's dead, we're slowly budding, growing infinitely. Energy, you of ways, whether you are, the pair began to attract. That pause, the mirror, A New Way Out of Samsara, reflective of Jung's archetypes. We will discuss each of these in snakes. Wisdom is the major arcana, is the key to the sessions life has yours, my love. Better or for lies thee, lulling yet provocative. Works thank you for your collaboration, but they can also create themselves on their starring own, thus of the angels, your interpersonal relationships, messenger like a mask, your soul. Mirroring work has begun, consciousness into a more, originally delineated by love to one. Eros is the burning one. Not at all. I would say it via the cutting up and have you done anything good? We are able to be. I've not done anything. But the pieces to create already know this. Tomorrow, should you don't. I can take one of those, we feel, got into the sing-song correlatives of it. That is, ever then, named, and the clients would answer. But they are affirmations, would confirm, yet they made know this eclipse period, and forth would develop a new way out of samsara. Cut-ups were used.